Hello, welcome to News Center. With me, Parikshit Luthra. The 17 G20 Summit has kicked off in Indonesia's Bali. The big focus on day one of the summit was the meeting between President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping, which could set the tone for US-China relationship in the days to come. Addressing the G20 virtually, Ukraine's President Zelensky called for an end to Russian invasion. Prime Minister Modi reiterated his call for peace and held several bilateral meetings on the sidelines, including one informal meeting with US President Joe Biden. Here's a roundup of all the action on day one in Bali. Competition should not turn into conflict. That was President Biden's key message to Chinese President Xi Jinping at the G20 Summit in Bali, the first in-person meeting of the two leaders.
We had an open and candid conversation about our intentions and our priorities. It was clear. He was clear and I was clear that we'll defend American interests and values, promote universal human rights, and stand up for the international order and work in lockstep with our allies and partners. We're going to compete vigorously, but I'm not looking for conflict. I'm looking to manage this competition responsibly.
Both leaders discussed the Ukraine-Russia war and agreed that any threat or use of nuclear weapons was totally unacceptable. While Biden raised objections to China's coercive and aggressive actions over Taiwan, the Chinese side conveyed that the Taiwan question was an internal matter and a red line that should not be crossed in US-China relations. The Chinese Foreign Ministry also said the world was big enough for US and China to develop and prosper. Tensions over the Ukraine-Russia war and its severe economic fallout is clearly weighing on every leader's mind at the G20. Addressing leaders virtually, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that it was time for Russia's war to end. He also requested for an extension of the Black Sea grain deal. At the summit, Prime Minister Narendra Modi met President Joe Biden, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, President Emmanuel Macron and President Mark Rutte of Netherlands. PM Modi called for an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine and warned about the consequences of the fertilizer shortage that the world is currently facing. Prime Minister Modi said at G20, and I quote, "I have repeatedly said that we have to find a way to return to the path of ceasefire and diplomacy in Ukraine. I'm confident that next year when G20 meets in the holy land of Buddha and Gandhi, we will convey a strong message of peace." UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has a 5-point agenda at the G20, which includes ending Putin's weaponization of food and energy. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said, and I quote, "It is notable that Putin didn't feel able to join us here. Maybe if he had, we could get on with sorting things out, because the single biggest difference that anyone could make is for Russia to get out of Ukraine and end this war." End of quote. There is still a question mark on whether the G20 will be able to arrive at a joint declaration due to lack of consensus on whether to condemn Russia and President Putin for the war against Ukraine. In New Delhi, Parikshit Luthra. All right, so that was a roundup of all the action from the G20. To take this forward, I'm now joined by Ambassador Neelam Deo, co-founder at Gateway House, Ambassador Rahul Chabra, former Secretary, Economic Relations at the MEA. Also joining us is Strategic Affairs expert Brahma Chalani. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us here on CNBC-TV18. Ambassador Chabra, if I can begin with you. Let's first weigh in on the meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden. In a way, both leaders are politically stronger when they came to the G20. President Xi has just got an unprecedented third term. President Biden's party, the Democrats, has managed to retain control of the Senate. They've performed better in the midterms than expected. How do you think this meeting will set the tone for US-China relations in the days to come? Ambassador Chabra, the question to you.
Oh, sorry, because it just got cut off at that time. Good evening, Parikshit. Good to see you. So yes, I think it really set the mood for the G20 summit itself. Just the sheer fact of having the meeting, firstly. I mean, it's President Biden's first meeting after having taken over. So that itself, both the leaders meeting. Again, they've obviously met earlier on other occasions at other positions that they held. But this was a really significant meeting. And what came out, I mean, no Cold War, no threat of use of nuclear weapons, enough space for both countries to grow together. So there was lots of the red lines were sort of drawn out. So while there was, strong messages going out on both sides, there was also enough of peace talk, so to speak, to calm the nerves, calm the tensions, bring them down. So it was a good starting point.
Right. Brahma Chalane, if I can come to you, sir. Chinese Foreign Ministry, after that meeting between Biden and Xi concluded, tweeted out to say that there is enough space in the world for both US and China to develop and prosper. How do you think the Chinese side has seen this meeting, and will this somehow bring down tensions between US-China on the trade front, on the economic front?
First, this meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping has overshadowed the G20 Summit, whose increasing politicization has been underscored by Zelensky addressing the G20, even if by virtual means. Ukraine is not a member of G20, but the Indonesian president came under pressure earlier this year to invite Zelensky. And this is a reminder of the challenges that India will face as it assumes the G20 presidency. But to answer your question, the Chinese Foreign Ministry's readout of the Xi Jinping-Biden meeting is very interesting, because that readout states very clearly that Biden reaffirmed 5 no's in relation to China. First, that the US does not seek to change China's system. It does not seek to revitalize alliances against China. It has no intention of decoupling itself from China or containing China, and that the US does not support 2 Chinas or 1 China, 1 Taiwan, and that the US is neither seeking conflict or a new Cold War with China. So China may not take all these assertions at their face value, but they signal Biden's attempt to appease Beijing, and they contrast starkly with Biden's Russia policy. With Russia, his approach is to seek regime change, to seek economic collapse in Russia. In fact, he has revitalized the NATO alliance against Russia. There is a new Cold War, which is now raging between Moscow and Washington. So the contrast between Biden's China policy, which has direct implications for India's security, and his Russia policy, which also has implications for India's policy and India's foreign policy and India's interest, because his policy approach is compelling Russia to pivot increasingly toward Beijing. So this Russia-China axis that is emerging is antithetical to India's strategic interests.
Right. Let me get in Ambassador Deo at this point. Ambassador Deo, when we read this meeting between Biden and Xi, Biden conveyed that there should be attempts to minimize differences, resolve differences through dialogue, and while there will be aggressive competition, competition should not turn into conflict. Give us a sense of how the meeting between Biden and Xi cast a shadow on the G20 this time around.
Well, I think, as Brahma said, it has overshadowed what's happening in the G20, the Biden-Xi meeting, as well as having the Ukrainian president address all the leaders who were there. I think there is an effort not only to pacify, if you like, the Chinese leader, but also to try to convey to all the other members of the G20, and especially the ASEAN countries, that it is not the United States which seeks conflict, and that it is not the United States policy to try to force them to choose between China and the United States, both of which are important to them, one politically more important and the other economically more important. But I think that this is early days. The Chinese statement and the statements that the Americans have put out after the meeting are different in important areas. And I think what has actually happened in the meeting will only come out in bits and pieces and over time. I think also that the issues between them are really significant. Apart from Taiwan, there is also the American policy and the actions they have taken to try to squeeze China on sophisticated technologies, particularly on chips. And I don't think that that is something that that difference will not be so easily set aside by China, which is feeling the pressure.
Right. Let me also focus now on Ukraine. Yes, Ukrainian President Zelensky addressed the G20 virtually. Ambassador Chabra, he said that the war must end immediately. He also asked for an extension of the black grain deal. The fact that there is lack of consensus on the joint declaration at Bali, because there will be opposition to condemning Russia and the wording on the Ukraine-Russia war. If we don't have a joint declaration, Ambassador Chabra, or we don't have a group photograph this time around at the G20, where will that leave the outcomes of a summit of this magnitude?
Yes, but it has happened before also that there have been other summits where there have been no final declaration. We have to understand how this final communique comes about. You know, it's the feeding in of an entire year long of activities of different groups, subgroups led by ministers, senior officials, Sherpas. So as we all know that consensus, and it's by consensus, so even one country can sort of hold it up. So there has been a lot of consensus on pretty much every other issue. So the only one or two paragraphs that are being held up are the ones about the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So if in case at the end they're not able to actually finalize the document, as you're saying, yes, there will be that sort of a little bit of feeling that they didn't come out with a communique. But pretty much leaders and countries would have agreed to a lot of other items which are there on paper, but not in the form of a joint communique. So it would be a sort of a little dampener, but still, all is not lost.
Okay. Brahma Chalani, if I can get you back in. You've tweeted some time back, and you were referring to it also in your first answer, that Ukraine is not a member of the G20, yet Zelensky's virtual address underscores the creeping politicization of this institution, thus undermining its consensus, also outlining some challenges that India will face. So today, the Prime Minister, while speaking at one of the sessions, said there must be immediate ceasefire in Ukraine, we must return to the path of diplomacy, and we must remember the fertilizer shortage that the world is facing right now, and it could very fast become a food shortage as well. Tell us about India's priorities there, Mr. Chalani, and what are the challenges that India will face once we assume the presidency of the G20, considering our close ties with Russia and the United States?
First, G20 is not an institution that should be discussing international peace and security issues. That's not the institution that Zelensky should be addressing. That's not the institution where Prime Minister Modi should be calling for a ceasefire in Ukraine. The G20 was established in the aftermath of the global crisis that occurred in 2008. It's a financial and economic institution that seeks to promote global development, seeks to stabilize the global economy. That's the mandate of the G20. G20 was never intended to be an institution that seeks to address international peace and security issues. And therefore, this increasing politicization of G20, its repercussions we have seen in recent months. In the run-up to the G20 summit in Bali, the foreign ministers of G20 countries met, then we had the finance ministers meeting, then we had the trade ministers meeting, and in all these meetings, no joint communique emerged. Not a single meeting ended with a joint communique, because now we have a global divide with rival blocs, which is creating a big crisis for the G20. The very future of the G20 today is at a crossroads. And therefore, for India to assume the presidency at this juncture, it's going to be a very challenging time. For India, this is going to be a huge challenge because you've seen how Indonesia, including its president, came under intense pressure from the Western Bloc. There was an attempt to exclude Putin from the summit. He eventually decided not to attend the Bali summit, which itself actually undercuts the purpose of the G20, which is to bring all the major economies together. The Indonesians came under pressure to invite Zelensky to let him address the G20, even though the G20 should not be the forum for Zelensky to be, talking about the war. There are other international forums, where the war in Ukraine can be discussed, but the G20 is not the appropriate forum. But the issue for India is that how does it navigate the new global divide? How will it be the chair of the G20, be able to withstand all the pressures that it will have to confront?
Welcome back. You're watching News Center. We have with us former Ambassador Neelam Deo, Ambassador Rahul Chhabra, also with us Brahma Chalane. Ambassador Deo, let's talk about the Indian Prime Minister's key agenda. Looking at the economic situation back home, challenges related to inflation, issues related to supply chain. What do you think will be the Prime Minister's priority as he goes about meeting the world leaders? We believe he has at least 8 to 9 meetings with the German Chancellor, with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, President Macron. So what do you think will be the big focus for the Prime Minister at the G20?
So I think that he will have 1 or 2 big focus items to focus on. One is, of course, the energy. The pressure that has been continuously brought on India not to buy oil from Russia. It's very heartening that India has stood its ground and has said that it will buy cheap oil wherever it can get it. And it has pointed out that the Europeans themselves, the West, is itself continuing to receive oil from Russia, which comes by pipeline. It's only trying to block those supplies which go by tanker. That is a big, important issue because now the West is trying to impose a price cap on Russian oil and to withhold insurance facilities for ships that will carry Russian oil. That will complicate our situation, but that is a big issue. The other big issues are, of course, the price of food and the price of fertilizers and the contribution of these 3 combined to generating inflation all over the world, but also in India. Now, inflation, of course, means price rise and it hurts the people of India, but it also means that the Indian currency loses value against a strengthening dollar. So you're paying more for everything you have done in the past, as well as in trying to raise money on the international market. Peace is important, and I think there have been some noises here and there for India to try to mediate. I don't think there's any particular reason for India to get into something where the 2 sides have fixed, entrenched positions. And I do want to say that, President Zelensky of Ukraine has addressed every forum under the sun, but he is now raising issues of war reparations, and I think the West is supporting him in that. I think we should not forget history. The last time countries were forced to pay war reparations, Germany, you actually had the rise of the Nazis and the havoc that created on the world. I think we should be looking for maybe peace in stages. The first thing to try to get is a ceasefire, not a full-scale peace, because that is something you have to work towards. And peace will require give and take, as all negotiations are required. There cannot be a situation where only one side gets to achieve everything it wants. At least for now, Russia has not been defeated militarily.
Right. Ambassador Chhabra, to get you back in, India assumes the presidency of the G20 from the 1st of December. This will be an occasion where Prime Minister can personally invite many of the world leaders for the G20 in India in September. Give us a sense of the priorities that India will have over the next 1 year during the course of our presidency.
The basic priority will be, as has been enunciated, Vasudev Kutumbakam, one Earth, one family, one planet. I mean, there is no planet B, there's no option, other option. So I think, and the youth of the world have sort of understood that message. So that's the broad message that we'll be conveying. In addition to that, we'll also be sort of showcasing where we have reached in terms of our digital technologies, health infrastructure, what we did during the pandemic, how we sort of were able to counter that. So we'll be showcasing that. We'll also be looking at how to move forward, like women-led development is one of the things. Climate financing is another issue. So these are the broad themes that we will be looking at the way forward. And then there's under a broad theme of shape the future. So, you know, even climate financing, we've been talking about it for some time, but now we need to sort of get out of the rut wherein multilateral and bilateral institutions are not finding it enough. So we're looking at private financing to come in to fill this huge void and gap in climate financing. But then maybe the role of multilateral financing agencies changing to sort of act as guarantors to this sort of financing. So this will be the broad trend and the broad sort of, we are also introducing something called Startup 20. So from the many groups of the B20, the Business 20, the Labor 20, the Student 20, the Youth 20, we'll be having a Startup 20. And we are also probably, we could look at, you know, the G20 does not have a permanent secretariat. So that's one sort of lacuna that is there. So institutional memory is short. So now with the digital infrastructure in place pretty much all over, so that may be one way of, rather than putting up a physical infrastructure, they could look at a digital platform to sort of have the institutional memory for the G20. So there's enough on India's plate to sort of handle for 1 year.
All right. All right, so there will be a packed agenda 1st December onwards. Brahma Chalane, final comments to you. We also saw a brief meeting between Prime Minister Modi, President Biden. They reviewed the bilateral relationship, also sectors such as critical and emerging technologies, advanced commuting, artificial intelligence. They also discussed the Quad partnership and the I2U2 as well. How would you describe this as a small pull aside on the sidelines of the G20 or an informal chat? This cannot be called a full bilateral, but how do you think US and India are going to work together in the days to come? Some of the priorities for the India-US partnership.
The Bali summit will be remembered for the Xi Jinping-Joe Biden meeting. There was very little discussion between Biden and Modi, but the US-India relationship is critical both for US interests and India's interests. As far as the Quad is concerned, given the fact that Biden is pursuing a softer, more conciliatory approach toward China, as a result of that, the security agenda of the Quad has taken the back seat. That security agenda has been put on the back burner, and the focus has been put on universal challenges, from resilient supply chains to global warming. Climate change, as you know, is Biden's pet subject. Quad is a four-country small group. It's in no position to deal with global challenges. Its focus ought to be on the challenges in the Asian regions or the broader Indo-Pacific region. Unfortunately, because of this war in Ukraine and the new Cold War between Washington and Moscow, US policy's leeway in relation to China has become increasingly constricted, and therefore the Quad security agenda is unlikely to advance in any meaningful manner. And the Quad was intended to be primarily a security initiative, and the Trump administration resurrected it with the goal of addressing the security challenges in the Indo-Pacific, especially the maritime challenges. But today, given
Right.
the constraints that US foreign policy faces. It cannot take on both Russia and China simultaneously. Therefore, the Quad is going to be a loser in terms of its agenda.
All right, we've run out of time, but Brahma Chalani, Ambassador Rahul Chabra, Ambassador Neelam Deo, thank you very much for joining us here on News Center, giving us your view on day one of the G20 and how everyone is talking about the Biden-Xi meeting and how the summit will be remembered for that critical meeting between US and China. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of News Center. Don't go anywhere. News continues on CNBC-TV18.